Hi, everyone. We are continuing our conversation today regarding Chapter 4 on family processes. And this is a pretty quick lecture, but it's focused on the family process of power. So let's start by getting a good definition of what we're talking about when we're talking about power. So power is defined as the ability or potential to achieve a desired goal or outcome. You can also think of power as the ability to change the behavior of the family member. Really simply put, you could simply argue that power is influence, right? The ability to influence another person. I think it's interesting when you think about power within a family to think about who in your family has the power, how do you know that, and just what does that look like, right? As you'll find when you read through the chapter, and as you'll find as you're listening to the lecture today, there are a lot of different ways to attempt to influence people and to change the way people act or behave. And so I encourage you, as you're listening to the lecture, just to reflect on your own personal experiences a little bit and really kind of think through who is powerful in your family and why. So in addition to the defining power, we need to talk about a couple of key assumptions regarding power. And the first assumption I have listed here is the idea that power is a multi-dimensional process. And what that means basically is that in order to be powerful, you have to have someone who is willing to submit to you or willing to accept your influence. So in other words, it's not like you can just walk around and say, hey, I'm powerful, right? Or I mean, you can try that, but typically it doesn't work very well, or at least not very long, right? You don't get to just declare that you have power. People actually have to be willing to grant you power, right? Or give you power or be influenced by you. So that kind of that component of someone having power and someone accepting that power is what we mean by saying that power is multi-dimensional. Additionally, it's important to point out that power is influenced by perception, right? And it might help to connect some dots here and think back to our theory chapter and think specifically about symbolic interactionism. And, if you'll recall, that theory was all about the idea that meaning is created through interaction, right? So what it means to be powerful, if it can be explained by that theory as well, right? And what power looks like in one family might not look like power in another family, right? Some family members or some families might be really influenced by, I don't know, guilt and disappointment and some of those kind of internal types of attributions. On the other hand, other families might be family members might be very influenced by more physical forms of power. Okay, but ultimately, the idea that power is influenced by perception simply just means that power is kind of this subjective thing, right? And various families define that in different ways. And then another layer to that, of course, is the idea that power is really influenced by culture. So you can think of cultures as like family culture. Every family has its own kind of set of rules and norms. But also, of course, you think of culture more typically as thinking like our American culture. And certainly, if you've taken like intercultural communication, you know that cultures have their own values, norms, and rules and things. And so maybe even some of those words like power distance or collectivistic versus individualistic cultures look familiar, right? So power certainly can be influenced by overarching cultural values, right? Our American culture tends to be somewhat masculine. It tends to be very individualistic, right? Or really prioritizing individual accomplishments, right? But it tends to have a relatively flat power distance, right? There isn't like a great hierarchy necessarily between authority figures and some of the subordinates. And so you put all those things together, and that can really influence what power means or what power looks like within an American family or American household. All right, so the majority of these slides will focus on this typology French and Raven developed labels for these 5 different types of power. If you've taken a business class or another communication class, perhaps you've heard of this typology before. It's a very commonly known way of describing power. So by the end of the lecture today, I want you to be sure that you can, first of all, identify the 5 different types of power in French and Raven's typology, but also I want to make sure that you can kind of define each type of power and kind of compare and contrast among the different types of power, and really be able to kind of recognize as well as generate your own examples of each of these different types of power. So we're going to spend some time looking at each one. Okay. Okay, so let's do that, right? So reward power. Reward power is pretty straightforward because it is, of course, power based on the ability to reward, or power based on the ability to offer some kind of incentive, right? Trophies would be an example often of reward power, right? People are motivated by winning a trophy or, a pot of money at the end of the competition, or something along those lines, right? Now, well, let's go through all of them, and then we'll do the comparing and contrasting. Punishment power, on the other hand, is the ability to influence or have power based on coercion or threats, right? So timeouts, spankings, being grounded, right? Those types of things would be considered punishment power because the person is being influenced by the fact that they don't want things taken away, right? So that's punishment power. All right, next we have legitimate power. Legitimate power is power that one has because of a position or a title. So you can see my little picture there is the presidential seal, right? If you are in a position of president, whether it's the president of a country or the president of your RSO, you have legitimate power simply because you hold that position or that title, right? Within a family, of course, I think legitimate power most commonly looks like your mom saying, do what I say because I'm the mom, right? I'm in that position, or I'm the dad, so you have to listen. Okay, that would be what legitimate power sounds like. Okay, let's see. We have expert power. Expert power is the ability to influence based on extra knowledge or experience. So someone may or may not actually hold a position of power or hold a certain title, but that person might have lots of previous experience in a relevant topic, or they may have done tons of research on the topic or lots of education on the topic. And because of all that knowledge and experience that they have that others maybe don't have, then they have the opportunity at least to use expert power or influence based on that knowledge and experience. Finally, we have referent power. And referent power is power that allows someone to be influential based on the fact that they are liked or respected, right? So getting someone to do what you want because the target likes you or respects you, right? Perhaps they kind of want to be like you. Perhaps they're a celebrity. Celebrity marketing is a really good example of referent power. Usually the celebrities are not experts on whatever they're trying to sell, right? They're not nutritionists, they're not scientists, but they are influential because the people watching them sell a product kind of want our lives to be like theirs, right? And we think, oh, if we just have the same products that they're promoting, then we'll be more like them. Right? So referent power is all about getting the target to do what you want because you know that they like you and they don't want to disappoint you, right? And they respect you. Okay, so that's a quick look at all the different types of power. Now, there are a couple of things I really want to make sure to point out. And the first thing to talk about is the fact that each one of these different types of power comes with different levels of effectiveness and, has some different types of implications, right? So some power is more effective than others depending on the circumstances. What we know is that generally speaking, reward power and punishment power tend to be pretty short-lived and tend to be more influential on kind of public rather than private behaviors, right? And you can think about why that might be. I think what's really happening when someone's trying to use reward or punishment power is that you are getting compliance but not necessarily understanding. So if someone's highly motivated to earn a reward, or they're highly motivated to avoid a punishment, they'll do whatever they have to do to make sure that they either get the reward or avoid the punishment, right? That doesn't mean that they actually believe in what they're doing, or understand why it's necessary. They're just in the short term trying to do what they have to do to either get the reward or avoid the punishment. Right? So that's part of why those types of power are really short-lived, right? And only work in public settings. Your book has some interesting examples about, like, at the grocery store, right? What reward or power or punishment power might look like. Another, I think, really important part of that is that both reward and punishment power only really work if the target is either interested in the reward or doesn't like the punishment, right? As soon as the target is not excited about the reward or doesn't care about the punishment, then that type of power no longer works, right? And of course, the person issuing the power has to be able to actually carry out the reward or carry out the punishment, right? I think of an example. When I was in elementary school, I had a teacher, and as part of the reward system, he would use a marble jar. And when you or the classmates did something good, he would add a marble to this marble jar. And the goal was to eventually get the marbles all the way to the top. And then once the marbles finally would overflow, then you got like a pizza party or something. So what was funny to me was, looking back, is that this teacher convinced us those marbles were invaluable, right? We were so desperate to earn those marbles, and we were so excited to get that pizza party. So at the time, those rewards really meant something to us. Don't know if you could pull that off as kids get older, right? Or at your office business meeting, right? The marble jar may no longer work anymore because those rewards just don't carry weight anymore. Okay. Okay, so those are some things to think about in terms of reward and punishment power. Now, on the other hand, expert power, referent power, those tend to be a little bit more long-lasting, right? And part of the reason for that is because they do tend to lead to the target really understanding, not just complying. And the target really realizes why the behavior should change. Not just I'm doing it because I want the quick reward or the quick I want to avoid the quick punishment. Okay. Now, with that being said, another thing that I think would be really useful to try to get these to stick and help to differentiate between them is to recognize that the same person can potentially try to use any one of these different types of power, right? It's not like I inherently have one type of power and you inherently have another type of power. I think particularly influential people are able to examine the situation, to think about the targets, and to figure out which type of power might be most influential, right? And so it's really important, right? It's not like I have one power and you have another power. It's that these are just different types of power that anyone can use, right? So I thought we would try a little bit of an exercise to try to help kind of work through that idea. So one thing that tends to be a universal kind of issue within a classroom, at least especially when we're meeting face-to-face, is the use of cell phones in a class, right? And I'm certain that you have had many professors in many different ways talk to you about cell phone usage in class and share with you their policy regarding cell phone usage. Right? Ultimately, of course, professors don't want students using cell phones in class, and you've probably heard all different types of ways that professors are trying to get students not to use cell phones, right? So I think it's interesting to now take these different types of power and think about what it would look like if a professor was trying to influence the class based on these different types of power to not use cell phones. Okay, so I think now might be a good time to kind of pause the video, and I really encourage you to take a few minutes on your own to think about that. I think it'll stick more if you do that. And then once you've done that, hit start again, and then I'll walk through what some of my examples are and kind of see if you've got the hang of it or not. Okay, so take a few minutes to do that. Let's assume you've done that. And so now let's come back and let's think about this, right? If a professor were trying to get his or her students to not use cell phones during class and they were using reward power, what would that look like? Well, probably the most straightforward answer that you came up with was something like, well, they would offer points, right? Or even offer extra credit. If you don't use your cell phone in class for today, you earn 5 points towards your class total, right? Or if you are never caught using your cell phone during class throughout the semester, you earn 10 points of extra credit. Makes sense, right? The professor's trying to offer an incentive. The professor knows that students are incentivized by better grades. The professor technically has that to offer, right? They are capable of actually giving out more points. Okay. Now, as we pointed out, that is probably not convincing students that why it is maybe not a good idea to use a cell phone in class, but potentially at least the professor might be getting the behavior that they want. On the flip side, what would it look like if a professor used punishment power to try to influence students not to use their cell phones during class? Well, in this case, probably the professor would say something like, if I see you using your cell phone during class, you'll lose participation points, right? I'll take those away. You will not be given attendance for that day, or something like that. Okay. Let's move on to legitimate power. Remember, legitimate power is power based on a position or title. So this would really simply sound something like, I'm telling you not to use the cell phone. I'm the professor. You need to listen to me. Right? In that case, the professor is relying on his or her position or title and assuming that that will be enough to influence the behavior of the students. Legitimate power is different than expert power, right? Expert power, on the other hand, would involve the professor doing something different, right? What would that look like? In this case, probably what would happen would be the professor would need to talk about his or her knowledge or expertise regarding the negative impacts of cell phone use during the class. I actually have a colleague who spends an entire day sharing findings from research that's examined the negative impact of cell phone usage during on students' performance in class. Right? He has a whole set of PowerPoint slides, and he goes through study by study by study. To me, one of the most interesting studies that he shares shows that there's this really powerful bystander effect when it comes to using cell phones. So this study found that if you were sitting next to someone who's using a cell phone, that your grade goes down on average at least a letter grade. Often it was 15%, just by sitting next to someone using a cell phone, right? You're not even the one using the cell phone. You're just distracted by their use. Okay. So in this case, expert power, or if a professor were using expert power to try to persuade students not to use their cell phones during class, they would actually be sharing information or knowledge or expertise regarding some negative outcomes with cell phone usage during class. Okay. Now, I hope my experience tells me that those two, legitimate power and expert power, are the two types of power that get confused the most, right? And so hopefully seeing those two examples helps distinguish things a little bit. Let me give you one more just to make sure. Okay. So imagine you went to your doctor and your doctor wanted to persuade you to be a little healthier. Maybe they are trying to convince you to do some more exercise, have a better diet. Now, a doctor could simply say, I'm the doctor, listen to me. You've got to exercise, you've got to eat better. If they did that, what kind of power are they using? Legitimate, right? However, the doctor instead, rather than relying on their title or their position, could say, hey, listen, I just read these recent articles that show a link between a bad diet and decreased life expectancy, or between a lack of exercise and poor mental health, or whatever, right? Here's some articles that I've just read, or maybe some research that I actually have just done. I wanted to share some of these findings with you. Based on all of this information, you really need to exercise more and eat better. So that sounds really different, right? That would be the use of expert power. In that case, the doctor has both types of power. They could technically use legitimate power or expert power, but depending on what they say, or they could. It sounds very different, right? And it's interesting to think about which one might be more influential, right? Certainly, we also know those situations where a person may have legitimate power but not expert power. Right? Maybe you've been in an RSO where the person who was nominated to the president knew nothing, right? But they did technically hold the position of power, or vice versa, right? Maybe as part of that RSO, you had a lot of information to share and were really knowledgeable whatever your RSO was doing, but maybe you didn't actually hold a position of power, right? So those things, you know, a person can have both or not, right? A person can have one or the other. All right, hopefully that clarifies things rather than confuses things, but definitely make sure by the end of this lecture that you feel pretty comfortable with the distinguishing between those two types of power. And the final type of power is referent power. You know, you can think about what would it look like if a professor were trying to use referent power to convince students not to use cell phones during class. Ultimately, this one really, again, is based on liking and respect. So I think the professor would have to do his or her best to kind of conjure up feelings of rapport, and would probably attempt to be liked, right, and be friendly and be kind and some of those types of things, but basically act in a way where the students felt like they were kind of disappointing the professor if they were using the cell phone in class, right? So the professor would rely on this idea that because the students liked him or her and didn't want to disappoint, that would be the reason why they wouldn't use their cell phones. Okay, so hopefully those 5 types of power are clear. If you have questions, of course, you can always email me about those. Last slide regarding power, just asks you to think very specifically about power within the family. And I just really want you to be kind of familiar with these types of terms. They're in your textbook, so you should be able to look them up. They're probably terms you're already familiar with anyway, right? In terms of whether the family has a patriarchal power structure and father figures in charge, or matriarchal power structure, and a mother figure is in charge. But just make sure that you can kind of identify those different types of power. Okay. All right, so we'll stop things there. Thanks.